for a cybernetic theory of human agency. And so the reason I wanted to study this is because agency is having something of a moment. People are being invited on big podcasts talking about being high agency. It's being called a buzzword, a tech buzzword in Silicon Valley. People, psychologists and philosophers on Twitter are talking about what it means to be high and low agency. But whenever they talk about what agency is, there's never any kind of scientific definition offered. It's always people who get things done, people who achieve highly, people who aren't afraid to go against the grain and do something that nobody has thought of before. But these are all very vibey or even like self-help based definitions of what human agency is. And so I wanted to look through the psychometric literature and develop an actual scientific theory of what human agency is and how we can measure it. So if we look at the scientific literature, it's not in a great state. So one book from 2003 said that probably no concept is as central to psychology and its aspirations, yet as poorly articulated as that on human agency. And no offense to the authors, but I don't think this book did a particularly good job either. There's kind of one of the schools of thought is to conflate human agency with free will, and I think that's kind of a category error. That's not what we're trying to do. Another way is to look at it as, this is a sociology paper from 1998, and it says, while routine, purpose, and judgment all constitute important dimensions of agency, none by itself captures its full complexity. So we lose a sense of the dynamic interplay among these dimensions. So I wasn't aware that they had ChatGPT in 1998, but apparently the dynamic interplay was there. And then a review from 2021 found that there were 26 different instruments to measure agency that were used from 2000 to 2020. But you get things like, what is agency? Or it could be critical agency, which is the belief that one can fight against racism. Or you have these scales, which are political and geopolitical agency, where it's two questions. Do you talk to your parents about environmental issues, and do you try to convince them of political issues? And it's like, this is how we measure human agency. Like, this is an honest attempt. None of these scales involved IQ or the Big Five or any other of the psychometrics that I'm actually going to be discussing in this talk. And there was no evidence of any kind of effort to develop a nomological network for what agency is. It honestly seemed to me like it was motivated based on trying to justify social justice or public health interventions. Like, agency is an a priori good, so if we develop some measure of it, then we can have a public health intervention that increases it, or something like this. It was not really scientifically motivated. It seemed kind of purely politically motivated, as you can see based on these two citations from that study. So just to give you a broad outline of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to start with an abstract definition of what an agent is, pulling from cybernetic systems theory, then talk about what specific kind of agents humans are, referencing like active inference and the free energy principle, then talk about cybernetic interpretations of the Big Five, and then finally get to some specific psychometric scales and how those relate to the question at hand. So to start, we should know what a cybernetic agent is, just in an abstract sense. So it's a coherent system with goals and a perception action loop. So a thermostat is a simple example of a cybernetic system. It has a goal, which is the temperature set point. It can perceive what temperature it currently is, and it can take actions to raise or lower the temperature to achieve that set point. So a cybernetic system tries to minimize deviation from whatever the set point it has. And so stress is the result of deviation from the set point, which then motivates corrective action. So if you're not stressed about something, and we can kind of anthropomorphize that, if you're not inclined to seek corrective action for any kind of state, then it's not something that you're going to interact with. When we want to start to quantify agency, something being more agentic than something else, we have to think about A, the problem space that it's working in. So a thermostat is just working in the problem space of temperatures. Humans are working in a behavioral and linguistic problem space. We're solving problems that have to do with taking behaviors out in the world and communicating with other humans through language. And those are the main domains that humans are optimized to function in, but agents can operate in any kind of problem space. But it doesn't really make sense to compare between problem spaces, but we can compare within organisms operating the same problem space. And then you want to look at the spatial and temporal extent of the goals that a system is working to solve. So somebody can be motivated just to solve goals or to maintain set points in their immediate environment, maybe just their home and for day-to-day living, or they can be motivated to pursue goals that might take decades to fully be realized, or that encompass their town, their nation, or the entire world. And anybody who's pursuing goals that are over longer time horizons and over larger spatial extents can be considered more agentic than somebody who's pursuing short-term local goals. And then also there's the complexity scale of the goals that an agent is working in, whether it's a complex computational or industrial system versus a relatively simple, maybe agrarian system. The complexity scope is also relevant. So demonstrated agency is the final result of the sum of an agent's action in the world, but it can be broken down just like Eysenk's theory of genius was creativity and hard work and intelligence. I think demonstrated agency, that is the final result of an agent's behavior, can be broken down into the agentic scope, that is the scope of the goals that it's trying to achieve, its agentic capacity, which is its actual ability to achieve those goals, to move towards those goals, and then the environment that it's working in. So obviously, you can be somebody with great ambition and great competence, but if you're in jail, you're not going to achieve very much, and that's not a result of your internal states, it's a result of the environment that you're working in is very impoverished. Similarly, if you're stuck on a deserted island, you might get more done compared to somebody with lower competency and lower ambition, but the scope of your goals is going to be fundamentally constrained by that environment. Agentic scope could be also considered ambition, although I think it's broader than that. And then agentic capacity could also be considered competence, although again I think it's broader than that. So that is the abstract theory of agency. And now we get to what kind of cybernetic agents are humans. And pulling from the free energy principle, which is work by Karl Firston, that states that the brain operates to reduce prediction error. And that's fundamentally what the brain does. So the set point for a human is to have zero prediction error. Obviously that's not possible, but you want to reduce prediction error as much as possible. So try to minimize the distance between the set point you're defending and the actual state that you're at. So there's two ways to do this. One of which is to update your world model based on the perceptions, the sense data that's incoming. And the other way is active inference, which is to take actions that make your predictions come true. So if you have a prediction that you're going to get promoted at your job, you want to maximize the chances that that comes true, you would then have to take various behaviors that would make that more likely, like asking for a promotion, doing better, etc. So as a mathematical formalism, because a lot of this is very mathematically formalized, it can be distinguished from reinforcement learning, because with reinforcement learning, agents have a policy of the actions they can take, and then there are certain states that have rewards that are like extrinsic. We just apply a reward to the state, and then the agent tries to learn what is the sequence of actions based on the policy I have that can maximize the reward that I'm going to get. In active inference, there is no reward. Everything is a prediction. So a state being rewarding is simply encoded as the agent being more likely to occupy that state. So a reward state is just defined as the state that is most likely from what the agent predicts. So then you take actions that maximize or that reduce prediction error, that is, that get you to those states that you predict you're going to be in, which are the reward states. And then how the brain structures perception and learning then directly influences this perception action loop. whether it perceives states correctly. And then this is also a very abstract neurological definition, but it does give us some clues about how agency works, because depersonalization disorder is a result of aberrant perception. So depersonalization disorder is when it feels like your actions are being taken by somebody else. It feels like somebody else is in control of your body. And the theory behind this, with reference to active inference, is that when you do something, when I'm holding this laser pointer, I know what it's going to feel like. I predict what it's going to feel like, and as long as there's no prediction error, I just ignore this, and I downweight the attention that I pay to the feeling of the pointer being in my hand. But in depersonalization disorder, the sense of me holding the pointer is not attenuated. And so it becomes very salient, and then when it feels like I'm not the one, and it feels like I'm not the one in control of this behavior because the perception is not being ignored correctly, basically. And so this relates to the phenomenological experience of having agency, but it doesn't yet get us to the point of being able to quantify what agency is, because the goal is to be able to understand what makes people high agency versus low agency. How can we predict the people who will have outside impacts on the world and on people around them, and how can we predict the people who won't have any particular impact? They will not be remembered by history. So another thing that we get from active inference is it characterizes the spectrum from autism to positive schizotypy. So basically, this is a spectrum, and there are pathological ends at both extremes, but this is just a normal spectrum of human variation, and it's basically how much attention the agent pays to prediction error. So with autism, they're very sensitive to prediction error, which is why they like rules-based systems where everything's very predictable. They gravitate to those things. They like routine. They're susceptible to sensory overload if they're in an overstimulating environment, like a rave, flashing lights, lots of people, lots of noise. That creates a lot of prediction error, which is then very stressful. And so one thing with active inference you can do is you can reduce prediction error simply by moving out of that environment. So you are changing your behavior, changing the world, changing the things that are around you in order to reduce prediction error. That's one way you can do that. Whereas on the other end, positive schizotypy, and there's also negative schizotypy, which relates to anhedonia and asocial behavior. It's specifically positive schizotypy that's on the other end of the spectrum, but that it relates to having unusual sensory experiences, feeling like mundane events in the world have specific meaning for you, and making connections between things as a result of this that more neurotypical people just wouldn't make associations between. And we are beginning to be able to characterize this with computational psychiatry models. So basically there's one experiment where you tell subjects that there's a helicopter dropping things, but you can't see the helicopter, it's above the clouds, and you're trying to estimate where the next package will be dropped from the helicopter. And it's basically just taking samples from a Gaussian where the variance can change, like the wind speed might change blowing the packages, or the helicopter can move. And you're trying to figure out a statistical parameterization for how the subject modifies their beliefs based on new information coming in. So Bayesian updating, but fitting a particular model called a hierarchical Gaussian filter to do that. And so this is one example. So this is a low variance, the helicopter's not moving, the helicopter moves, the beliefs get updated, helicopter moves again, but now the variance also increases, and then you can see some of the parameter space for how the agent is updating, just based on the responses where the human subject thinks the next package will be dropped. Now this is an emerging way of characterizing this. This has only developed in the past 10 years, but unfortunately, as with pretty much every behavioral task, computational models suffer from limitations due to lower reliability. So what we really want are psychometrics that are very reliable that we can use to characterize agency. I think this is core to agency because it describes how an agent updates its beliefs about the world and how it structures its behavior. But I don't think we're quite at the level of being able to run reliable studies that can directly be used to draw inferences about how people behave in the real world. This is kind of restricted to lab settings, and like I said, it's not as reliable as it could be, but psychometrics are very reliable. So how can we link psychometrics to human agency? Well, there is a model of cybernetic Big Five. This is developed by Colin DeYoung, who's actually one of Jordan Peterson's former grad students. And it theorizes that each of the Big Five describe evolutionarily selected cybernetic parameters that an agent uses to navigate the world. So a trait like openness or extroversion or conscientiousness describes a density distribution of states that the agent will occupy. If you're high in neuroticism, then the density function of you being in upset or sad or anxious or depressed states is simply higher. If you're extroverted, you're more likely to be engaged in goal-directed behavior or behaviors that give you a reward. And so this directly relates back to active inference, because active inference describes the states that the agent is likely to be in, and the cybernetic parameters that are part of Big Five are basically priors on, like biologically encoded priors on what states the agent expects to occupy as it goes throughout its life. And so these can be selected for different humans have different priors on the states they expect to occupy, and in order to reduce prediction error, they will take specific actions to achieve those states more reliably. Finally, there are also characteristic adaptations, which are learned patterns of behavior. For instance, the specific tasks you undergo at your job, or the specific way you respond to your spouse, which are influenced by traits, but they're not directly caused by the traits. They can be well aligned or less well aligned with the traits. For instance, an introverted person in a sales role, they will have characteristic adaptations that make them more successful, but those characteristic adaptations are fundamentally at odds with the distribution of states the person expects to occupy. Similarly, for a person low in compassion but in a caretaking job, they would develop the characteristic adaptations but not be well suited for it at the trait level. And so I'll talk about each of the Big Five in turn, but just briefly, there's neuroticism, susceptibility to or neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness. And there are two higher order factors, stability and plasticity, which stability comprises the shared variance of extroversion and openness, and stability, the shared variance of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and the inverse of neuroticism, which is sometimes called emotional stability. So stability, then, is basically the protection of goals or interpretations or behaviors from disruption by impulses, positive or negative impulses. And plasticity is exploratory, the creation of new goals, new behaviors, etc. And these are not fundamentally in tension. You can see that the negative pole would be unstable, as in they have difficulty maintaining their behaviors, difficulty defending them from impulses, or rigid, they're not likely to explore new things. So exploration is not the opposite of stability. You can explore, develop stable adaptations as a result of that exploration, and these are not fundamentally in tension. They're not negatively correlated. And we have some data showing that plasticity basically gives rise to behaviors and stability inhibits behaviors. So there was one study that looked at a suite of 400 behaviors and created a structural equation model where you had plasticity and stability, which each predicted the behavior. And plasticity and stability were fed into by the Big Five traits. And basically they opened a path from one of the Big Five to the behavior, and they saw if that had a statistically significant increase in the model fit. And if it did, they decided that that was a behavior that was better characterized at the trait level. But if you could free up paths one at a time for any of the Big Five, and it didn't result in any statistically significant increase, that was deemed to be a behavior that was the result of one of the meta traits, stability or plasticity, as opposed to the individual Big Five level. And so basically all of the associations for stability are negative, they're inhibiting behaviors. All of the associations for plasticity are positive, they're spurring behaviors. So these behaviors were grouped. You can look at stability was negatively predictive of anger behaviors, nervousness, overeating, motorcycles and hitchhikers, irritation, sex, laughter, jokes, whereas plasticity was predictive positively of interpersonal warmth, going to parties, laughter, jokes, sex, travel, dating, dieting, politics, right? So at the broad level, stability is inhibiting certain behaviors, plasticity is giving rise to new behaviors, especially exploratory behaviors. There's a hypothesis that I think is relatively well substantiated that plasticity is underpinned by dopamine in the value networks for extroversion, so reward, and the salience network, so attention, for openness. And then stability may be underpinned by serotonin, but I think the data is less supportive of this, or at least it's less cohesive. I think the dopamine hypothesis is relatively strong. So the first, extroversion, breaks down into two aspects, assertiveness and enthusiasm. So assertiveness is about goal-directed reward, so incentive reward, goal pursuit, whereas enthusiasm is consumptive reward or appetitive reward, so enjoying food or company or drink or sex or anything like that. Wanting versus liking, basically. Assertiveness is wanting to achieve goals. Enthusiasm is liking particular stimuli. They're both underpinned by dopamine, but it seems that there's also a component of the endogenous opioid system that contributes to liking. And so it's not just dopaminergic reward, but it's also consumptive opiate reward. And then you can see some of the behaviors that were found to be related to extroversion: planned a party, told a joke, entertained people, volunteered, tried to get a tan, even colored my hair, these kinds of things. And again, all positively predicted there. No negative associations with behavior. Openness is the responsiveness to the reward value of information. So some people perceive more reward in information than others. That would mean that some people are more likely to be in states where they're engaging with information in some way. It breaks down into two aspects: intellect, which is the reward value from engaging with abstract or semantic or logical information. And this is the only of the big five that correlates with IQ at about 0.3 to 0.4. And then the other one is openness to experience, which is more aesthetic information. So it's experiencing reward from perceptual or sensual information, so more correlated with enjoying music or art or literature. And then the association between IQ and intellect also points out that personality is not disjoint from ability. If you have more capabilities in a certain domain, or as a cybernetic trait, you're more likely to end up in states that are supported by that ability. And so again, some of the behaviors associated, produced a work of art, read poetry, painted a picture, read a book, bought a book. Again, all positively predicted. Then we get to the various components of stability. So conscientiousness breaks down into orderliness and industriousness. So industriousness would be the prioritization of long-term goals, basically at the expense of shorter-term impulses. So it can be considered that the probability density of ending up in states satisfying short-term impulses is downweighted, and the probability density of being in states that are supposed to be rewarding long-term is increased. And actually, extroversion and conscientiousness are predictive of overall activity levels. Specifically operationalized as physical activity, but it's difficult to operationalize like cognitive activity. But we can see that people who are more extroverted, that is, they perceive more rewards, and more conscientious, they pursue longer-term goals, they have higher just levels of activity in general. And so orderliness is the other one, and that is the avoidance of entropy by following rules either that you impose for yourself or that others have imposed. So orderly people have specific ways they want to do things, ways they want to organize their desk, ways they want to structure their day, and they don't like being they don't like deviating from that. And then so conscientiousness, again, almost all of these are negative. Only the last one is positive. Listen to music. Who knows why that was there, but discuss sexual matters with a male friend. That was very unlikely if you're conscientious, picked up a hitchhiker, read a tabloid, drove without a seatbelt. These are all behaviors that conscientiousness is negatively predictive of. Agreeableness is fundamentally a social dimension. Extroversion, not actually fundamentally social, but because so many human rewards are encountered in company, it ends up expressing in social behavior. But agreeableness is fundamentally social, and it's about coordinating with others. So it breaks down into compassion, so that's like emotional attachment, concern for others. Also seems to be related to the opioid and oxytocin system and the relations between those systems. It's also correlated with enthusiasm from extroversion, probably because of shared variance in opioid function. And it's almost as strongly correlated with enthusiasm as it is with the other trait that's part of agreeableness, which is politeness. And politeness is avoidance of aggressive behavior, avoidance of behavior that violates social norms. And so for agreeableness, the associations aren't entirely negative, but there are a lot of negatives here. Gave money to a panhandler is increased, but drinking at a bar, producing a work of art, rode a horse, these are all negatively predicted by agreeableness. And then the last one is neuroticism, which is susceptibility to negative emotion, which breaks down into withdrawal, which is basically the avoidance, the down-regulation of goal-directed behavior in response to threat, and volatility, which is active defense against things that are threatening your goal-directed behavior. And for the associations with neuroticism, it's all basically like you're more likely to take medication, you're more likely to take sleeping pills, to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and these are all just as a result of having higher levels of negative emotion. So one question you might ask then is is there anything to agency that is beyond the Big Five and IQ, or is all of human agency just a function of Big Five and IQ? I'd say that to the extent that Big Five comprises the basic cybernetic parameters that humans operate by, no, there wouldn't really be a difference. I do think that Bayesian learning, the autism schizotypy spectrum, is not well characterized by Big Five. There are some associations with openness, which I think is related to shared dopamine behavior, but the Big Five does not really assess unusual perception or atypical cognition. And so I think that is a cybernetic parameter that's fundamentally different from Big Five. But even if Big Five does characterize most variation in human agency, I think the goal is to discover the nomological network, to discover the relationship between which humans achieve the most in life and which specific aspects of the Big Five, and also why. So we want the minimal covering set. We want to know all the things that relate to human agency, but the minimal set. So if assertiveness is much more important than enthusiasm, we don't just want to say that extroversion is important. We want to say that specifically the goal-directed behavior encoded by assertiveness that's important, as opposed to the appetitive, consumptive behavior that's encoded by enthusiasm. And it's also true that a broad scale like the Big Five has high bandwidth. That is, it tries to characterize a broad set of behaviors, but that means it has more limited fidelity. It's less good at characterizing specific behaviors that are still influenced by those higher level traits. Additionally, I think interstitial scales that pull from multiple of the Big Five to characterize a specific kind of behavior, are also very important. So we really want to know where human agency comes from. We know some of the basic cybernetic parameters that will eventually give rise to agency, but which ones and why. So since an agent has a perception-action loop, it needs to start with perception. If you cannot perceive a set point, you cannot minimize deviation from that set point. So just as an example, some people are born with congenital analgesia. They can't feel pain, and pain is the signal that indicates deviation from bodily integrity. So these people put their hand on the hot stove and they don't feel it, and they often die young from complications resulting from accidentally hurting themselves because they're not able to perceive that they're deviating from a set point that they should really be defending if they want to stay alive. There are some more quantitative estimates of the costs of disabilities. So when you're calculating disability-adjusted life years, there's a metric called the disability weight, which is used to weight how serious a disability is. So deafness has a disability weight of 0.21, blindness 0.19. So we can say at a broad level, being deaf probably reduces your overall agency by 20%, being blind by 0.19%. These are rough estimates, but to be more psychometric about it, we know that, or Spearman hypothesized, that there was a relationship between G, the general factor of cognitive ability, and a general factor of perceptual ability. And this has been replicated recently. And the general factor of perceptual ability correlated with G at 0.68. So your ability to distinguish between different tones, between different colors, between different weights, that is pretty strongly correlated with just how generally intelligent you are. And so people who are more intelligent will be able to perceive differences better, will be able to construct more world models, etc. And then also just deficits in perceiving social cues will result in reduced ability to develop or to maintain any kind of social set points like reputation management or mate retention, things like this. And that will reduce your efficiency in those domains. There is also a question of the environment that you're in. If you're in an asocial environment, these things won't really matter, but human environments are all broadly similar in terms of the perceptual abilities and the strategies that are required to navigate them. And so you definitely want to have the full suite of perceptual abilities to be able to defend relevant set points. Then we get to the first real psychometric, which is called agency and communion. You'd think that a scale called agency would be featured in the literature reviews of agency research, but as it turns out, it's not. But this was originally proposed in 1996 by Bacan in not a quantitative form, a very theoretical literary form. But roughly, agency is getting ahead and communion is getting along. And we can extract these two factors both from life goals data and values data. And so these are two data sets. And so this is Schwartz's value circumplex, I believe. And just a factor analysis explains something like 50% of the variation in this. And so the agentic life values are stimulation, hedonism, achievement, self-direction, and power. And the communal ones are benevolence, universalism, security, conformity, and tradition. Similarly, we get it from life goals. So economic life goals, hedonistic, relational in this data set, political, those are all agentic, whereas aesthetic, religious, and social, those were communal. But it was only in 2012 that a specific scale was developed to assess agency and communion. So basically they got 12 adjectives and asked you how much you value these specific things. So for the agency goals, it was status and power and superiority. For the communion goals, it was compassion, civility, altruism, honesty, etc. And these showed very clear sex differences. I think pretty much all of the agency ones were strongly male weighted, and all of the communion ones were strongly female weighted, with D of up to like 0.6. The full scale delta between men and women was not given, but item level data showed a clear difference. And then Paulhus and Trapnell, who did this study, also looked at the nomological network of this. And so, for instance, if you take a sex roles inventory scale, femininity correlates with communion, and agency correlates with masculinity. The dark triad has been characterized as basically being agency absent communion. So agency is relatively strongly correlated with the dark triad. However, if you take the difference between agency and communion, you get a stronger correlation there. Also, unrestricted sociosexuality predicted by agency, negatively predicted by communion. So they are moderately correlated with each other. However, if you control for self-esteem, that is just general positive self-regard, where you're more likely to rate yourselves highly in all of these things, the correlation drops to like a negligible 0.13. There was a study that constructed agency and communion scales out of Big Five questions, which was able to do it with very good reliability. And basically all of the agency questions were assertiveness questions. and then maybe one question about like intellect or not withdrawing from situations, so negative neuroticism. And then all of the community questions were agreeableness questions. So if we want to look at actual life outcomes as a result of these, one sample of German students, agency scores correlated with both subjective and objective career success between 0.21 and 0.29. And this is after a period of 18 months after leaving university, and the test-retest reliability was 0.7. So generally reliable and predictive of life outcomes. We can also look at the big two. So the big two are stability and plasticity. But how do they relate to agency and communion? Some people have supposed that they are the same, but the data from the Big Five study indicated that they're not really. Agency actually predicted both stability and plasticity in this sample, whereas agreeableness and conscientiousness specifically was predictive of communion. But we can look at big two in other domains. So in lexical data, we find that the big two that emerge are not stability and plasticity, but instead agency and communion. Similarly, in social evaluation of others, you evaluate people based on whether they get along with you or whether they're trying to get ahead. And this is also reflected in the types of socially desirable reporting that people exhibit on personality questionnaires. So people are likely to emphasize their intellectual and social abilities or their benevolence and how good of a person they are. One other paper that was disputing the existence of plasticity and stability was trying to propose a different model, and they found that industriousness, intellect, and inverse withdrawal were all correlated with extroversion. And so in the dopamine hypothesis of plasticity, basically DeYoung was hypothesizing that maybe these are all influenced by dopamine as well, but this looks remarkably like an agency factor that can be discovered in the Big Five. Additionally, it found that enthusiasm went to plasticity and politeness went to conscientiousness. So there are overlaps in the Big Five, but I think this does demonstrate that agency is a thing. Finally, we can also look at ambition versus competence, so which one actually predicts life outcomes. And it seems like agency is more predictive of life outcomes than actual competence. For instance, anybody at any level of the social hierarchy may be expected to be competent in their job, whether they're a doctor or a ditch digger or whatever, but only people at the higher levels are expected to be agentic and ambitious. And so there were some studies that coded words as either agentic or ambitious based on a factor analysis of user responses, and some artificial profiles were constructed that had people who were either high in agency or high in competence, or low in both or high in both. And the high agency, low competence was actually better than being low agency, high competence, although of course having both was much more predictive. And then it seems like the relationship is also bidirectional, so people who are high in agency are expected to be higher social status, people who are high social status are expected to be more agentic in social evaluation. We can look at conformity. So conformity is largely predicted by so it can be predicted either by stability and plasticity. So they were using some desirable responding scales, which do analyze desirable responding, but also some level of actual variation in those traits. Because if you're high in communion, you might want to desirably respond that I'm a better person, but that is also how you try to behave because you're very susceptible to social influence. And so it was predicted by stability and negatively predicted by plasticity, but it was a much stronger effect with stability. And then if you look at agency and communion, if you look at religious countries, agency predicts being irreligious, while communion predicts being religious. Whereas in irreligious countries, the relationship is the opposite. So communal people will adopt the specific societal values that they experience around them, whereas agentic people will find contrarian values. Whether that's in a religious culture or an irreligious culture, it will be the opposite. Then we can also talk about identity. So there is some research in identity that comes out of Erik Erikson's research. This kind of preceded rigorous psychometrics or was developed independently. So there is some concern about the psychometric validity of these scales, but I think it's a valuable frame anyway. So how can we characterize identity cybernetically? I would say that identity is the suite of characteristic adaptations that you currently display based on the situations you find yourself in. And then it is your priors on the characteristic adaptations you may display in the future if the environment changes. So, you think right now, I love my wife, I have these behaviors that I do with my wife, and I'm not doing any kind of dating or flirting behaviors with other women, but if I were to get a divorce, then these other behaviors would be what I would do in that circumstance. Whereas other behaviors I wouldn't do. I wouldn't be open to polyamory or other things like this. So we can operationalize identity with the objective measure of ego identity status scale, which basically assesses your identity in political, career, relational, or religious terms. And it's assessing basically how committed are you to particular identities, particular patterns of behavior and belief, and how much of that commitment is spurred by an actual exploration of those particular areas, and how much of it is just conformity with what your parents or with your society. And so there are 4 statuses based on this diffusion: is no exploration, no commitment; moratorium is not yet committed but exploring; foreclosure is commitment with no exploration; achievement is commitment after having explored this. So again, psychometric validity, one thing to note is that dichotomizing scales reduce reliability, and it's not clear that moratorium and diffusion are actually different things. They're pretty correlated, so it might just be that you can have no identity, you can have a committed identity that you've sought out for yourself, or you can have a committed identity that you were given by your society. And we know in the Big Five that moratorium and diffusion are correlated with neuroticism and inversely correlated with extroversion and conscientiousness, whereas achievement shows the opposite, and foreclosure is inversely correlated with openness, like quite strongly. So less open people are much more likely to simply adopt the social mores and behavior sets that their society displays for them. And then in terms of real life outcomes, diffusion and moratorium are correlated with procrastination. Foreclosure shows no relationship, but achievement is correlated with negative procrastination. So you're more likely to get things done if you're high in exploratory behavior, you've committed to a particular path in life, and you're pursuing that of your own accord. So for cybernetic systems, they can be found on a spectrum of persuadability, where basically persuadability are the types of inputs that are required to get the system to change its behavior. So for a thermostat, you want to adjust the set point directly. For a dog, you might want to train it with reward stimuli. For a human, you might use an emotional appeal, or you might use a rational argument to get them to change their behavior. So in a system that's persuadable, as any agent is capable of changing its behavior, you don't want the levers that enable you to change the behavior to be too easily accessed or too legible, because that opens you up to parasitism or to people changing your behavior in a way that negatively affects you. So, in ants, the cordyceps fungus causes them to change their behavior. In humans, propaganda can get you to change your behavior. But in general, higher agency systems are more persuadable, right? But they must maintain control over their more persuadable subsystems. Humans are obviously trainable via classical conditioning or operant conditioning, but you don't want to let somebody condition you if that's not what is in alignment with your higher order goals, right? So you want to defend those lower level subsystems from external influence because they pose a threat to the agent. The agent will become disordered in terms of having all of its goals be coherent and all of the subsystems be aligned towards those long-term goals if they get disrupted. So we can look at persuadability and IQ. So my point is basically that in order to only be persuadable at the highest level, which would be a cogent, rational, evidence-based argument, you need to be able to assess and be persuaded by that argument. And if you cannot understand that argument, you cannot be persuaded by it, and you must fall back on emotional appeals or appeals to authority or normative behavior, etc. And so we can look at the PIAAC data, which looks at the OECD countries and assesses levels of literacy and numeracy. And so in the US, 44% of the population is literate at a level 3, 13% at a level 4, and only 1% at a level 5. So level 3 would be like understanding and arguing in a blog post. Level 4, analyzing and synthesizing contradictory articles. Level 5 would be evaluating competing theoretical frameworks and analyzing a certain situation under the different frameworks and being able to flexibly apply that. For numeracy, 38% of the population level 3, 12 at level 4, and 2% at level 5. So level 3 would be like evaluating the accuracy of simple arithmetic in an advertisement they claim is 50% off. Is that true? Level 4 would be like interpreting a multivariable graph to draw conclusions about the subject matter. Level 5 would be like performing some basic statistical modeling of the data set. And based on this, I would say that level 3 in both of these is kind of required to assess any kind of, or to understand even, any kind of logical evidence-based argument, which corresponds to about 100 IQ. However, you wouldn't necessarily be able to decide between competing logical arguments unless you're at least maybe level 4, which would be about 115 IQ. Level 5, I think, is about 130 IQ. And there's no reason to believe that there's any limit on the agency conferred by being able to assess information at higher levels, but I would say that about 100 to 115 IQ is basically required to be convinced by logical argument. Otherwise, you're simply going to be emotionally manipulated. That's the only lever that people have to interact with you, and you're not able to organize your long-term behavior in a way that is coherently structured around explicitly kind of detailed ideas. But we can also look at susceptibility to persuasion, because low IQ is a risk factor for being manipulated, but also just the temporary suspension of the rational faculties. Even a smart person can be scammed or manipulated if you can get them to suspend their rational faculties for a period of time. Scam compliance is one thing you can look at for this. So if you're going to be scammed, first they have to come to you with an offer that you have to believe is plausible, you have to interact with the scammer, and then you have to finally give them your money or lose utility in some way to them. And then there are some scales that were used to assess this. They don't have great predictive power, but there are statistically significant associations. So basically, finding a scam offer to be plausible is correlated with social influence, which is like how agreeable you are, your level of self-control, which is conscientiousness, need for uniqueness, which I think is an aspect of openness, of aesthetic appeal, sensation seeking, which is extroversion, and then need for cognition, which is intellect. So these are all things that correlate with finding a scam offer plausible. Ultimately, if you think it's plausible, that itself is the strongest predictor for responding, and then the strongest predictor for being scammed is the fact that you did respond. And these end up being relatively negligible at that point. But one study of older adults basically found that among people who'd been scammed, the largest predictor was lower cognitive ability. So this relates to impulsivity as well, because impulsivity comes in two stages. There is the impulse that you feel, and then there is whether that impulse is suppressed or not. So impulses can be positive or negative. So impulsivity is conceived of to be based on sensation seeking, which is observing rewards, extroversion, urgency, which is like threat salience, neuroticism, and then lower levels of premeditation and perseverance, which are aspects of conscientiousness. So you can have an impulse, but then whether that impulse is suppressed or not actually determines whether you act impulsively. And it can be impulsive manic-like behavior, impulsive gambling, stuff like this, or it can be impulsive negative behavior. I'm upset, I'm going to cut myself. Those are all types of impulsive behavior. And obviously, engaging in impulsive behavior disrupts the goals, disrupts the set points you're trying to achieve. You want to be coherent over a long period of time and not be swayed by all of these different impulses. Impulsivity can also be found as a psychometric factor. This study looked at a bunch of different scales of impulsivity, both psychometric scales over here and the behavioral scales over here. So again, this is a demonstration that behavioral measures are not very reliable. They don't correlate very well even with each other or with psychometrics. However, you can get a general factor of impulsivity I which does correlate with these. These are found in the list of psychometrics. And it's predictive of behaviors like compulsive buying, eating, watching TikTok videos, etc. And then the last psychometric I'm going to talk about is risk preference, so how willing you are to take risks. Similarly, you can extract a general factor of risk-taking behavior. It's not very correlated with the behavioral measures again. However, the psychometric measures and the propensity measures, that is how often you actually engage in various risky behaviors, were all very correlated, and you could get a general factor out of that. But these are risky behaviors in domains like investment, socialization, recreation, etc. Also, obviously, all of the risky behaviors, drug use, sociosexuality, etc. And then the general factor is predicted by openness and extroversion, and negatively by conscientiousness and agreeableness, which again looks kind of like plasticity and stability or agency and communion. So is there any broad empirical support for the psychometrics I've been talking about for the relationship with these various big five parameters? One Dutch study of 1,900 people used a regression model to figure out the influence of the big five on income, and found that openness and extroversion positively correlated with income, while agreeableness and neuroticism predicted it negatively. Interestingly, conscientiousness was not predictive in this particular data set. But once education and the status of the profession were included in the model, openness was no longer predictive, which suggests that the benefit of openness is that it increases the complexity scope of goals that you can achieve, which is usually associated with higher remuneration. So once you control for the complexity scale that you're operating at, openness is no longer predictive at that point. A different data set of over 40,000 UK households found that IQ was by far the strongest predictor of three measures: income, occupational prestige, and occupational status. How those are operationalized, you have to read the paper and the stuff that's based off of. But there are a bunch of results here. One thing is that they did find that conscientiousness was predictive even after residualizing for intelligence. So red is not residualized, blue is residualized for intelligence. So conscientiousness was predictive. Agreeableness was negatively predictive of income, but slightly positive for occupational status and prestige for some reason. In this data set, extroversion was actually negatively predictive even when residualized for IQ. And then, willingness to take risks was positively predictive. Note that this was only one question. It wasn't like a full risk scale, so take that with a grain of salt. Neuroticism negatively predictive as expected. And then openness, once you residualize for IQ, very little effect. So I would say there is empirical support. One had conscientiousness not being relevant, one had extroversion not being relevant. I think it's a thing for future research to look at, better operationalizations maybe. But one thing we can talk about is people generally think of agency as just being a de facto good. So why aren't more people agentic? Or why aren't all populations equally agentic? And I think it's because of the environmental selection pressures for or against agency. So there was a really good paper that came out recently by David Sun on Arcticist adaptation in East Asians, and that being the foundation for the observed differences in East Asian psychology. So the thesis is that there's a period between out of Africa and the development of agriculture that encompasses tens of thousands of years, and that East Asians lived in an Arctic environment during that time and then migrated southward, and this exposure to Arctic environments and the selection pressures therein shaped their behavior. And he compares between East Asian psychology, Inuit psychology, and the psychology of personnel on Arctic expeditions to see how that environment shapes psychology and what it selects for. And what he notes about Inuit psychology is that Inuit personality is generally described as emotionally controlled and repressed, calm, deferential, harmony-seeking, pragmatic, reserved, introverted, stoic, unassertive, non-confrontational, and self-sufficient. So I would say this is a notably low agency suite of personality traits. They're not assertive, right? They're not confrontational. They're not strongly seeking their own goals and trying to achieve those goals. They might be entirely competent, but the particular environment that they're in, for instance, needing to shelter with 10 other people in an igloo for a week at a time during a blizzard, it simply does not select for the kinds of behaviors that you would associate with agency. In such a risky environment, any kind of agentic risk-taking is just completely not adaptive. And so it selects for low levels of agency. Additionally, their epistemology, Inuit scholars generalize the Inuit worldview as dangerously uncertain and impermanent and constantly changing, right? So you're not able to plan over long periods of time in this kind of environment because the weather can change dramatically in a week, all sorts of things can happen. And so, contrary to Western culture, I think Western culture rewards agency, and I think this also ties back to cold winters theory. It's not the coldness of the environment full stop that's important, it's about having a harsh environment that you can plan for in the future, but then having other periods which allow for risk-taking and agentic behavior, which selects for high levels of agency while at the same time also promoting the development of intelligence and long-term thinking behavior. And so in an Inuit environment, taking risks like going out to hunt a polar bear on an ice floe, that could kill you and all of your hunting partners if the ice floe breaks off and you drift out to sea and you just die. So that's simply not viable. Whereas in Western cultures, the selective pressures are different. So I would say classical liberalism is kind of characterized as like do what you want, but I think it should be more accurately characterized as do whatever you can bear the seen and unforeseen costs of doing. And in such a risky environment, you simply cannot afford to bear the costs of highly agentic behavior. So this is one tie-in to group differences that we can look at for agency. Future directions for research, I would say the most important one is to develop scales that assess goal planning in terms of temporal extent, spatial extent, and complexity. My hypothesis would be that conscientiousness is most strongly associated with long-term planning, extroversion with spatially expansive planning, and IQ with the complexity of the goals you're trying to achieve. And then you want longitudinal research examining how goal pursuit changes over the lifespan, the way the goals that are pursued change, and looking at test-retest reliability and the nomological network of the scales I talked about in this talk. And then finally, we should expand the understanding of human agency, linking research to things like life history strategy and multi-level organization, like how the distribution of agency in a population affects outcomes at the population level. This talk was also specifically about agentic scope, but also investigations into how agentic capacity shapes agency, how it interrelates with agentic scope, and then how agentic environment relates to agency, for instance, with the selection pressures I was just talking about. So that's it for the talk.